The program this afternoon, part of our annual Holocaust educational program. So the program this afternoon is in memory of Mr. David Shapell, major philanthropist, benefactor of our yeshiva and seminary, as well as many, many other educational and Israeli projects. He was a Holocaust survivor, and Holocaust education was very important to him and to his wife and family. The Holocaust is the seminal event, or one of two seminal events of the 20th century Jewish nation. The Holocaust was the seminal tragic event. The founding of the State of Israel was the seminal positive event, and Mr. Shapell lived both of them. He lived Holocaust education, and for him, the response 3 years later of the State of Israel was something that inspired his life and his educational agenda, as well as his philanthropical agenda. I'm going to have something to say about that during my shir. But now we're going to open with an address from one of our dear alumni, Dr. Dan Polisar, the founder of the Shalem College, and something that none of you lived through. You at best know about it from the history books, but I remember it as a small child and certainly did not appreciate the transformative effect it had, and that was the capture of Adolf Eichmann, when the assumption was that all the main Nazi people were out of reach. The capture of Adolf Eichmann, and then how the trial in Israel really became a game changer in the attitude towards the Holocaust, and I'm sure that Dr. Polisar is going to have a lot to say about that for us, and this will be the opening lecture in today's program.
On May 23rd, 1960, Knesset members were all informed in the morning that there was going to be a special political announcement that the Prime Minister, the founding Prime Minister of the state, David Ben-Gurion, was going to be making. Virtually nobody in the Knesset, apart from a handful of ministers, knew what David Ben-Gurion was going to be saying, but it was rare for him to make a special announcement, and there was this real palpable sense of tension in the room as he mounted the podium. And he got up there, and in one of the shortest speeches in Israeli history, in fact in all of Jewish history, he said the following, in Hebrew of course: "It is my duty to inform the Knesset that not long ago Israeli security forces tracked down one of the greatest Nazi criminals, Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge, together with the Nazi leadership, of what they referred to as the final solution to the Jewish problem, meaning the extermination of 6 million members of the Jewish community of Europe. Adolf Eichmann is already held in custody in Israel and will soon be brought to trial in accordance with the law on bringing about justice to Nazis and their collaborators of 5710, the year 1950. And with that, he came down from the podium, and the announcement was over. People who were present reported a total sense of shock. One would have thought Israelis of that generation, having come through the War of Independence, having come through the Sinai campaign, having seen the founding of the state, the adults among them having lived through and heard about the Holocaust, would have been prepared for just about anything. For this, they were not prepared. It was expected by this point that it would be very difficult ever to bring any of the Nazis to justice, that those who had escaped to Argentina or who were in hiding in one country or another weren't going to be found. And in fact, at this time, there was a wave of anti-Semitism sweeping through Europe. This happened in 1959 and after, And it reminded people of the old days that were only a decade and a half earlier, and there was this sense of powerlessness. What can we be able to do? What can this small, still fragile Jewish state do to make sure that Jews are safe wherever they are in the world, whether in Israel, in Europe, or anywhere else? That was the background to what Ben Gurion getting up and making that announcement. If you looked at the headlines in the Hebrew newspapers in the days after, I'm not referring to the religious Hebrew newspapers. I'm referring to the ostensibly secular Hebrew newspapers. You open it up, the headline says, Shehechiyama. Right? You open it up, and you see the headline is from Psalm 94, O Lord God, to whom vengeance belongs. The whole country had this swelling of Shehechiyama. Thank God we have lived to see a moment when perhaps some modicum, some small fraction of justice can be done and a change can be brought about. It also began an extraordinary paradigm shift in the way that Israelis viewed the Holocaust and in the way that Israelis viewed the people, the men and women and children who had survived that Holocaust. The story is an incredible story. I wish we had several sessions to really give the story itself the justice that it deserves. What I'm going to do instead is to touch on 4 major aspects of this and leave time for questions afterwards. I'm going to begin with what made Adolf Eichmann a figure worthy of bringing to Israel for this. Right? He wasn't waiting around in Israel to be tried. He had been in hiding in Argentina. So I want to talk about what made him a figure who it was worth the effort to bring and that it was possible to bring over. Second, I want to talk about what it actually took for Israel to bring Eichmann to trial. Third, I'll talk about the trial itself. And fourth, I want to talk about the impact it had on Israel with respect to the Holocaust and perhaps more broadly. So we'll begin with Eichmann. Born early 20th century, high school dropout for the first 2.5 decades of his life, a little bit longer. He was a failure. He was a failure. His family knew he was a failure. He knew he was a failure. And then along came the Nazi Party, rose to prominence in the late 20s and early 30s, rose to power in 1933. And suddenly this individual who looked like he had nothing ahead of him saw his purpose, saw an opportunity to contribute and to gain and to be a somebody. And the somebody he decided to be was a member of the Nazi Party, a member of the SS, somebody who was going to do big things. And for him, a big thing to do was to damage, cripple, harm the Jewish people. He joined the Hebrew division, the Jewish division of the SS, and in that capacity, he actually learned Hebrew. Right? The SS, of all institutions in the world, had a budget to teach him Hebrew. And in fact, he went to Palestine in 1937 to scout it out, to see whether it might be possible to deport the Jews of Germany and perhaps other places to Palestine, because at that time, no decision had yet been made about the final solution. 1938, a turning point again for Eichmann, the Anschluss, the German reunification with Austria, partly by force and partly by the acquiescence of a good portion of the Austrian people and leadership. And one of the first orders of business was to be deporting Jews. And Eichmann stepped up to that challenge, and the first time he really made a name for himself was the efficiency with which he drove Jews out of the country. He rose and rose in the ranks, and once the final solution began in practice after the invasion of Soviet Union by Nazi Germany, and backed by a real decision at the Wannsee Conference, Eichmann was in many ways the point man for bringing it about. He was a logistics guy, right? His strength was making things happen. And when you think about it, a huge part of the final solution, of the attempted extermination of the Jewish people in Europe and wherever else the Nazis could reach them, was transportation. All the death camps were in Poland. Many of the Jews were in Poland, but a lot of them were outside of Poland, and even those in Poland needed to be brought to very particular points. And it was Eichmann who, with relatively limited resources, but always demanding more for this task, set about this work systematically, and we have to say with pain undimmed by the decades that have gone by since then, with a great deal of success. His crowning achievement, if one can use a word so noble for an accomplishment so repulsive, was to bring about the transportation and deaths of most Hungarian Jews. This is late in the war. The Nazis were pretty clearly losing the war. They actually needed to divert resources to this effort in order to make sure they could transport and murder as many Jews as possible, principally in Auschwitz. And with the clock ticking, the man who made that happen, that is, the man whose efficiency is responsible for the fact that even more tens or hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered from Hungary than would otherwise have been the case, was Adolf Eichmann. The war ended. Many of the Nazi leaders were arrested, and in 1946, at the Nuremberg trials, led principally by the United States, there were many of them who were convicted and who were executed for their crimes, principally their crimes against humanity, more than their crimes against the Jewish people. Eichmann, at the time, was in a camp for prisoners of war, living under an assumed name. No one around him knew that he was one of the arch villains, and his name did come up at the trial. One of the people who had been his lieutenants quoted him, perhaps accurately, hard to know, saying, "I will go into my grave laughing that I was responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews." Once that was said, he could read the handwriting on the wall. He escaped from that prisoner of war camp, hiked up into the mountains, lived under an assumed name for a number of years. At the right moment, around 1950, he moved to Argentina. Why did he move to Argentina? Argentina had a reputation as a place where former Nazis could live in relative solitude, relative peace, relative obscurity, and not worry that they were going to be extradited to Germany, which could have tried them, or extradited to some other country, or tried in Argentina itself. And if you were a typical Israeli, especially if you were a survivor, late 1950s in Israel, you would have thought that, like so many of the Nazis, Eichmann had escaped justice and there wasn't anything that could be done. That brings to the end the first part of this story, which is why was it so important for the state of Israel to bring about justice for this particular Nazi war criminal? Now, second part, how could this be done? Well, let's begin with a legal obstacle, and David Ben-Gurion referred to the relevant law when he spoke to the Knesset in May of 1960. The crimes that Eichmann was involved in committing took place mostly from 1938 to 1945, before the State of Israel existed. They took place in areas that are not only not part of Israel, but not even close to what ended up becoming Israel. And since there was no State of Israel at the time, the crimes were not committed against Israeli citizens. So the idea that Israel could do anything about this from an international legal perspective was not so simple. But in 1950, the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, passed a law which in many respects articulates what it means for Israel to be the national state of the Jewish people. That law is the law on bringing about justice to Nazis and their collaborators, which said, notwithstanding the fact that there wasn't a state of Israel, and notwithstanding the fact that these crimes occurred outside of what later became the state of Israel, there is a Jewish people. And there is such a thing as justice, and there is such a thing as acting on behalf of those who had not the power to bring about justice on their own, but whose blood still cries out, whose relatives are still in inexplicable unspeakable agony over what happened, and it is the role of the State of Israel representing the Jewish people to bring about that justice. So the law said crimes committed against humanity and against the Jewish people will be punishable on a criminal basis in Israel if we can find and try the people who were involved in it. It's a very, very gutsy law to have passed from a constitutional perspective, but the people who passed it felt that it articulated something very profound about what had changed between 1939 to 1945 when there was no Jewish state, and 1950 when there was a Jewish state willing and able to act on behalf of the Jews. So that's the legal basis. The operational basis is a lot more complicated. Right? We all have, most of the people in this room have grown up in a world where it's assumed that Israel has extraordinary capacity in terms of its intelligence, in terms of its ability to carry out operations not only on our borders but anywhere around the globe. That was not the case in 1959 as this operation was being planned, and in 1960 when it was being carried out. It was a very small intelligence community. Israel was militarily nothing like what it is today. It did not yet have an alliance militarily with the United States. It did not yet have, according to foreign sources at least, nuclear weapons and the capacity to make more nuclear weapons. It was a very, very different Israel. And yet, it was seen by the leadership of the country that one of the most important things to do with those limited resources was to act on the sentiment behind the law about bringing Nazis to justice. And so there was an operation carried out. The details are utterly fascinating. I would be happy to come back at the appropriate time and speak just about the operation itself. I'll touch on just a few elements of it so we can understand the lengths to which Israel was willing to go to bring this about. So let's start with something that is simply not believable. There was a man named Isser Harel, happens that he wrote this book, but that's not what he's known for. He was known for being the founder of Israel's intelligence community. He was de facto he was the head of the Mossad, he was the head of the intelligence community. He had a lot on his plate. He decided this was so important that he personally moved to Argentina to supervise the last few weeks of the operation, to identify Eichmann, to kidnap him, to smuggle him back to Israel so that he could be brought to justice. Just think about it for a moment. He's in another country where what he is doing is clearly illegal. Most countries have rules that prevent you from kidnapping their citizens or residents and flying them to a foreign country to put them on trial. Had he been found, he would have been arrested, and Israel would have been in the incomprehensible situation of having one of its senior intelligence officers in jail, tried by a foreign country, ostensibly a friendly country, for undermining their sovereignty. But he considered it worth taking that risk because it was so important to him to bring Eichmann to justice. He and his lieutenants set up a principle, which was that only people who wanted to be part of this kidnapping and moving to Israel operation could be part of it. Right? They could have just given orders, right? The military is the military, the security services are security services. They could have just said, these are the 8 people we need, you're all going, we're not asking your opinion. That's what it means to have a security services in a country that has the draft and that has the power of coercion. But they decided that this was too important to be left to people who were forced to do it, and so they asked people who they thought were the right ones. As far as I understand, not a single person turned them down. I'll just share quickly 2 stories of people who were asked to go so that we can understand why they chose to join in this mission. First, there was, and I'm quoting from the book written by Isser Harel, The House on Garibaldi Street, about the capture of Eichmann. First, there was Ehud Revivi, an outstanding operations man, an excellent planner, proficient in several languages, and experienced in actions abroad. Ehud was the son of an assimilated family in Vienna, Austria, who led a pleasant, easy life until the day Austria was annexed to Hitler's Third Reich. For Ehud, the change manifested itself when about 30 of his classmates fell on him and another Jewish boy in the class and gave them a brutal beating in the presence of the teacher, who didn't intervene. Ehud was confined to bed for 2 weeks, and when he was well again, he didn't go back to school. His father's business was confiscated, and then the family was evicted from their apartment. Ehud's childhood memories were interwoven with visions of the flames from the synagogues on Kristallnacht, the crystal night, the night of broken glass. The day World War II broke out, the persecuted family reached the safe shores of Israel. Ehud finished high school, joined the Palmach, and later served in a reconnaissance unit in the Israel Defense Force. Goes on to describe a little bit of his background. Second story, right? You can understand with that background, the brutal beating, the family driven out, why he would think that bringing a Nazi arch-villain to justice is something worth risking his life and his safety for. Eli Yuval, the second man to appear on the list, was born in Poland. He went to Israel with his parents when he was 6. His sister and her 3 children remained in Poland. It was impossible to get immigration certificates for them, and they were murdered by the Nazis. The day the youngster Eli heard about the fate of his sister and her children, he swore an oath to avenge their deaths. When Eliezer Reviva informed him that he'd been chosen for the operational team, and what's more, according to the preliminary plan, he would be the first to come into physical contact with Eichmann at the moment of capture, he regarded it as the fulfillment of his vow. Right? Those are the kinds of people who went, the list goes on. They were people who had a very personal stake in this on behalf of the Jewish people, but on behalf of themselves and their very closest family members. Eichmann had been living in Argentina under an assumed name. He was a very precise man, always came home from work where he was a foreman, he was in management, he was a logistics guy, always came home on the same bus. On this particular evening, for whatever reason, he didn't take the regular bus or the one after that or the one after that, and they were worried. They were waiting at the bus stop, near the bus stop. They were worried that they might be discovered. They figured they'd give it just a little more time. He came off the bus, looked like they thought he might have a gun because of how his hand was in his pocket. He was tackled, taken into the car, brought to a safe house that the Israeli team had rented for purposes of identifying him, interrogating him, and holding on to him for 10 days. Understanding that his family might go to the police, but that they might be afraid because if they involve the police, then his background could become known. There isn't time to speak about what happened as they identified him, as he first denied that he was Adolf Eichmann and gave a series of other names until finally they showed they had so much information about him that he admitted it. But the part that has to be said is after it became clear that he couldn't any longer tell these people whom he understood were Israelis that he wasn't Adolf Eichmann. He said, "Yes, I'm Adolf Eichmann. Yes, I was in the SS. I was in the Jewish division. I learned Hebrew. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad." And the 4 people who were there, he was bound. He couldn't get anywhere. They didn't have to worry that he was going to escape. They left the room. They just couldn't bear to hear the holiest sentence in our language, in our tradition, uttered by one of the unholiest set of lips ever to pronounce those words. Short time later, they drugged him, got him on a plane back to Israel in disguise, brought him to Israel, and it was there, just a day or 2 later, that David Ben-Gurion then made the announcement with which I began these remarks, and that draws to a close the second part, which is, how was he brought to Israel? Third, I want to speak about the trial itself. Again, it's a very long trial. It's a fascinating trial. There's a lot to be said about it. The short version is as follows. In the 11 months leading up to the trial, before Eichmann was interrogated in a top secret facility because there was this tremendous fear, I think quite justified, that somebody wanting to take revenge wasn't going to wait to see what the justice system would do, but would act more rashly, and that would have been a disaster, both in terms of Israel's reputation for being able to hold safe trials, and in terms of actually bringing to justice a man by talking publicly about what he had done, and not just having vigilante justice, as justified as that might have been. So he was in a top secret facility, obviously without other prisoners near him. He was more or less living with his guards and the interrogators. He was checked twice a day by a doctor to make sure nothing untoward happened to his health. And every bite and every item of food that he was going to eat was first tasted by one of the guards, and then they would wait the appropriate amount of time to make sure that the guard didn't fall ill or die of poisoning. Like the way kings and other people used to be treated, let someone else take the risk. He had to be kept alive at all costs. And the interrogators, over the course of those 11 months, developed about 3,500 pages of information, and with that the trial began. And the prosecutor was none other than Israel's Attorney General, who does not normally act as a prosecutor, but this was not anything like a normal case. He opened with words that are eminently familiar with Israelis, certainly of that generation, but anybody who understands the country's civil or political tradition, if you ask them what are some of the most famous lines ever uttered in a speech, they might say, "B'makom zeh, bo ani omed lifnechem, shoftei Yisrael, lelamed kategoria al Adolf Eichmann, ein ani omed yechidi. Imadi nitzavim kan b'shah zo 6 milyonei kategorim." In the English translation, and then continuing for just the beginning of this speech of the chief prosecutor, the Attorney General, "In the place in which I stand before you, judges of Israel, to prosecute Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. With me at this moment in time, I am joined by 6 million prosecutors, but they are unable to rise to their feet, to point an accusing finger at that glass booth, and to cry out against the man sitting there, 'I accuse.' Because their ashes have settled among the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka, were wasted by the forests of Poland, and their graves are scattered across the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voices are unheard. I shall therefore be their mouths, and I shall read in their names this terrible bill of indictment." And he went on, and during the course of the trial, what the prosecution sought to do was to bring to life, as prosecutors, to the extent one can, those 6 million witnesses. Right? Well, the 6 million witnesses, as was noted so eloquently, couldn't stand up and couldn't speak, but Israel did have 300,000 survivors. And many of them had been in the camps, many of them had survived barely and miraculously, and had a tale to tell. And the strategy was to have at least one witness, a survivor from every country in which the Nazis had murdered Jews. And legally speaking, the strategy was based on the idea of conspiracy to commit crime. Even if you didn't see this individual pull the trigger or put the gas in to the crematorium, if there's a group of people who collectively are responsible for murder, then you can treat each and every member of that group as if he were responsible for it, and on that basis, Eichmann was tried. His defense, quite famously, was, "I was only following orders." He didn't deny the facts, he just said, "I was ordered to do these things, that was my job to do these things. I cannot be held culpable morally and legally for having done the thing that I was asked by my superiors to do." The trial itself went on for many months. In the end, he was convicted, sentenced to death. He appealed that death sentence. The appeal was rejected, and he appealed again for clemency from the president of the state. That appeal was rejected, and in the end, he was hanged. His body was burned, and cremated, and the ashes were scattered, but not in Israel, over the Mediterranean Sea, outside the territorial limits of Israel, because the message was, we don't want anything about this human being and the atrocities he committed to contaminate our newly arisen country and our ancient and holy land. And with that, I draw to a close the third part, which is the trial itself. Fourth and finally, the impact on Israeli society. Again, A great deal could be said about this. I'm going to touch on it, and I hope in the time that we have for questions we can discuss it further. This was an absolute turning point in Israeli history. And Americans of my parents' generation, if you ask them, where were you when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, they can answer it. If you ask Americans of a later generation, where were you when 9/11 took place, they can answer that. If you ask Israelis of the appropriate generation, where were you when Ben-Gurion made the announcement about Eichmann, they can give you that answer. They remember it, they can tell you where they were, they can tell you how they felt, they can tell you what their parents said to them or what they said to their children. And the message was an extraordinary one. In Israel, and it's hard to imagine and hard to believe, but the evidence for it is overwhelming. The Holocaust was not discussed from the early and mid-1940s, when it became known in Israel that it had taken place, until the time of the Eichmann trial. There were small exceptions to it, but you didn't talk about it. If you were a survivor, you didn't open your mouth, and to the extent that people spoke to or about Holocaust survivors about their experience, it was all too common to refer to them as sabonim, soaps. A horrific epithet meant to refer to the fact that they had gone like sheep to the slaughter, and one of the many horrific deeds of the Nazis was to turn human beings into soap. And so that was one of the cruelest epithets, but in general it just wasn't something that you talked about, not even to your children. You just didn't open your mouth on this subject. It wasn't even taboo, because taboo, you have to think about it for a moment before you say, no, I can't do that. It wasn't done. The Eichmann trial opened up the floodgates in an extraordinary way. All of a sudden, survivors, these 300,000 people, not only could speak, but many of them wanted to. And their children and their grandchildren and friends and neighbors who had always thought of them as these strange people, sometimes with numbers tattooed on them, who you didn't really want to talk to, and you certainly wouldn't ask about what happened over there back then. All of a sudden, they became the heroes. They were the people who were front and center in the person of those who gave witness at the trial and those who gave witness outside the trial. I'll share just two examples personally of people I know who talked to me about the impact on them. One of them was actually from this morning. The president of the college that I'm at, Shalem College, is a great historian of the Second Temple period and of the Talmudic period, Shai Gafni. And he asked me why I dressed up like this, since this is not how Israelis in academia typically dress up. And I said, I'm coming to my yeshiva, to a place to which I have an enormous debt of gratitude, to talk about one of the most solemn subjects. He said, oh, what's that? And I said, Eichmann trial. He said, I was in high school at the time in Israel. I was in Pardes Chana at Midrashiyat Noam. I would take a bus at the end of, on certain days. I would come to Jerusalem. You have to go to the Russian compound to get a ticket to get into this, because everybody wanted to go into it, and there was a lot of security. And then you went to Beit Ha'am on Bezalel Street, and you could go. And he said, there were many days when I went there, and I asked, well, did this affect your life? He said, absolutely. It's not that the previous generation didn't talk to us. Not that my parents' generation never talked about the Holocaust. No one talked about it. All of a sudden, we learned about it. All of a sudden, we were opened up to a completely different world. He went on, Shai Gafni went on, among other things, to do some pretty risky things to help Jews in the Soviet Union back in the day when that was dangerous. Became and remains a great historian of Jewish history, and part of that spark came from this. I'll tell you about a second friend of mine, also an academic. In this case, I won't use his name. Somehow, he and I got to talking about the Eichmann trial a couple of years ago. And he said to me, it's one of the most embarrassing things that I can say, but in the 1950s, when I was growing up, I was one of those Israeli kids routinely calling survivors to their face, sabon, soap. He said, it's embarrassing to me that that's what it was, but that's just how it looked in our social circles, because we were the sabers, we were the strong people, we had risen up, and they were the sheep who had gone to the slaughter. They were the Jews of the exile who had set the worst example, and we were the tikkun, we were the correction. He said, during the Eichmann trial, I was riveted to the radio, day after day. The trial was on all the time, and in high school classes, by the way. My friend didn't go to any of his classes per se, but had he gone to his classes, he would have seen that the teachers allowed the classes to have the radio on to listen to the trial. Then you got home at night, and at 7 o'clock you listened to it. And he said it totally transformed the way that he saw the Holocaust, that he saw the Holocaust survivors, that he saw the Jewish people. And in fact, today he says, I am first, he's, by the way, he's quite secular, like demonstratively eating on Yom Kippur secular. And he says, I am first and foremost a Jew, and only secondarily an Israeli. I'm an Israeli because I'm a Jew, and a large part of his Jewish identity came from this. Now, I gave 2 examples. Look at it society-wide. A society in which the survivors were seen as the anti-heroes of the story of the Jewish return to sovereignty became a society in which the Holocaust survivors were viewed as people of enormous courage, people who had gone through something unspeakable and had lived to tell about it, had lived to move to Israel, had lived to choose to be Jewish, had lived to raise their families to be Jewish, to rebuild those families. So it totally changed that. It changed the way Israelis viewed the Galut. It was no longer this disconnect. 2,000 years of Galut, we have to rebel against that, we're doing something new. It led Israeli society to embrace them. It led people to understand again, what is the purpose? Why do we have this Jewish state? Right? We all know in this room that there are many reasons for this Jewish state, but one of them is to have a body that has power and that can act on conscience on behalf of the Jewish people, in this case claims of justice for the Jewish people, but also deterring future anti-Semites that might choose to rise up. They should know that the arm of the law and the willingness to extend that arm is long and is great. And in that sense, the Eichmann capture and trial was a transformative experience. It sought to preserve the memory of the Holocaust to a generation that otherwise would have grown up without it, and it succeeded. It sought to give people a sense of why we need this state, and it succeeded. Fast forward. It's January of 2019. Nearly 6 decades have gone past since then. And it is absolutely essential, since we aren't going to have another Eichmann trial, for all of us to study about the Holocaust, to study about what happened in it, to study about what Jews did in response to it, to understand and appreciate the role of the State of Israel as part of the response to what happened. In a sense, our task is harder than those who sat glued to the radios. They had the evidence before their eyes and could speak to hundreds of thousands of survivors who were part of their community. For us, the effort is a greater one, which is why I'm really honored to be here at an event which is about Holocaust education in the memory of a man who survived that Holocaust, lived to do great things, lived to appreciate the State of Israel, and it's a fitting tribute to him that all of us are here studying this together. And with that, I will open this up to any questions that people have up until I'm told that question time is over. The only thing I will not allow is the possibility for a Jewish discussion in which no one has a question or comment. That would be like an existential crisis for the Jewish people. So, yes?
The categories you were discussing about in the trial, are they like, and based off that book, I've been trying, I want to buy the book, but I've always forgot what the name was. Is that like order of how the book is structured?
When you say
like,
categories,
is that like, no, you were giving like, you parsed your speech in regards to events. In the book, is the house on
Garibaldi Street.
Garibaldi Street, is it parsed the same way?
No, this book is a personal memoir of the person who probably more than anyone else was responsible for the decision to capture Eichmann and to bring him to trial. In fact, there's an amazing story. Isser Harel tells that when he became the head of Israel's secret services, he said, I used to spend a lot of time sitting and thinking about what I would have done had there been a state of Israel at the time of the Holocaust. And I think I would have taken all, we couldn't have decided the war. We couldn't have saved the Jews directly. But maybe, just maybe, if we had had sovereignty a decade earlier, we could have done one thing. He said, I would have spent all of the efforts of the entire state and people trying to assassinate Hitler. Because if we had done it at the right moment, then perhaps we could have prevented the Holocaust. And he said, and we didn't do that, and we couldn't do that, and because of that, I'm dedicating my life not only to Israel's security, but to making sure that the anti-Semites of the world know that there is a state of Israel, and to bringing to justice those who we came too late to save. So his book is very much a personal account. There are a number of other books of the capture of Eichmann that I've also read. This is probably the leading academic book on the Eichmann trial by Chana Yablonka. Originally came out in Hebrew, then in English. But the way I structured it is my own structure, massively abbreviated. Let's say if I read 1,500 pages and lots of sources, I gave you not even the SparkNotes version of it, but the much, much shorter version to put it within the context of a paradigm shift on the Holocaust within Israeli society.
Yeah.
Yes?
Name?
Yes.
Hi.
Sorry, I don't know names.
I'm Sarah. Was there any point throughout the trial that it looked as though legally they couldn't prosecute him? Was there any doubt throughout the trial?
So the doubt did not come about in the trial itself, because Israel's law from 1950 on bringing about justice to Nazis and their collaborators was very clear. If you were suspected of having committed crimes during that particular period in that part of the world against humanity or against the Jews, you could be brought to trial. So from an Israeli perspective, there wasn't any doubt. Where there was doubt was on the international perspective. This will come as a shock to all of you who have grown up thinking that the United Nations is perennially friendly to Israel, or at least extraordinarily fair, but the response to the kidnapping of Eichmann was to condemn Israel and to say that this was an unjustified violation of Argentina's sovereignty. Now, Israel had a reason for it. The reason was, it was very clear, if they had just said, if they had said to the Argentinian government, we have information, this man Ricardo Clement, who's living in at this address on Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires, is in fact the notorious war criminal Adolf Eichmann, and we want him extradited either to Germany or to Israel or tried. It was fairly clear that somebody would give him a tip-off and he would go into hiding so deep that it would never be possible to find him. So Israel had a very good reason to act, but many nations, including initially the United States, sided against Israel. I mean, to them the biggest thing that had happened was not the bringing to justice of the highest ranking Nazi not yet brought to justice, but rather the fact that Israel kidnapped somebody on Argentinian soil. So there was a period of negotiation, or at least conflict. Israel made it abundantly clear, we are willing to apologize. Israel did apologize, but the deal was essentially, we will apologize for having taken him, and then we're going to try him, just like we had been planning to do. But once the trial started, there weren't doubts like that. Do you want to call on people? This is like actually okay. Alex,
Was he the first person brought to justice post 1950, and how many people were further?
Yeah, so that's
Similar way.
that's the part of the story that we don't usually like to talk about, because in fact this law was to bring about justice to Nazis and Nazi collaborators. Those Nazi collaborators were in many cases Jews who had done things that they shouldn't have done in order to save their own lives during the Holocaust, in many cases understandably so, right? If we put ourselves in their position, maybe we would have done what they did. But many of those Jews who went over and above what they needed to do in outing their fellow Jews, in helping to transport their fellow Jews to places where they were killed, in helping to maintain the death camps, many of those people came over to Israel after the war. And those who had been their victims, looking at the guy who, 5 years earlier had been there in the death camp, reasonably healthy because he had one of the jobs for collaborators, and you saw your wife and children taken away in the line where they were murdered, it was hard for you to see him not in prison. So there were initially trials of those who had collaborated. As far as I know, Eichmann was the first Nazi, non-Jew senior official who was brought to trial under this law. And the power of the law was not that it got so many people, but the message that it gave. One of the stories that just impacted everybody who saw it was at the beginning of the trial. The judges came in. Eichmann was in a bulletproof glass cage that became the symbol of the trial, obviously bulletproof to prevent anyone from killing him. And as soon as the judges came in, Eichmann almost instinctively stood up. And people thought about the fact that 15 years earlier, people under his command, acting in line with what he wanted, were certainly not standing up for Jews. They were murdering those Jews. And the symbolism of that v'nafochu, that reversal, was not lost on anybody. And that's why the trial was of such significance, even though it's only one man.
What do you think is the best way to keep having this meaningful conversation when Israel and the Jews are no longer understood as the underdog anymore? Like, you contrasted a lot the fact that this was 1960 and now it's 2019.
The most important part of the conversation is the internal one, the one among Jews. And we first need to understand that, of course, we have to maintain the highest moral standards in dealing with our neighbors, whoever those neighbors might be, Arab or otherwise. But at the same time, we have to understand that we retain the status of the underdog, and that we're the ones to whom there is an existential threat to this day. Israel is the only country in the world that has been under existential threat for every moment of its existence. Literally, there has not been a single day where you can say, well, it's 1968, June 27th, no existential threat to the country today. There literally hasn't been a moment like that. And so we first need to remind ourselves of what our position is. Second, we need to remind ourselves that sometimes you have to act very powerfully in your own defense. And we also have to remind ourselves that when Jews are unable to act to save and protect themselves, horrific things can happen, as they've happened throughout history. So this needs to start with us. If we, as the Jewish people writ large, I know not the entire Jewish people is in this Beit Midrash right now, but we represent that Jewish people. If we first have an understanding of what happened and where we stand today and what we need to do, then the task of explaining it to others is going to be far, far easier. But I think our work is overwhelmingly internal and only secondarily external. David?
Part of your narrative was that it seemed like in the early days, at the time of the trial, the state of Israel viewed part of its mission as standing on behalf of the Jewish people. Do you see that to be the case now as much?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that relatively briefly since it isn't directly on the topic, but the state of Israel has a series of laws and traditions that cause the state to act on behalf of the Jewish people. So, for example, much more recently than the Eichmann trial, we sent some of our our best and bravest soldiers to Ethiopia and to the countries around Ethiopia to save people who were not Israelis, did not know Hebrew, had never set foot in Israel, many of whom were not what we would consider to be halachically Jewish, but Israel acted on their behalf. More recently, there is a part of Israel's Mossad, I have been told by friends who know more than I do, whose job it is to protect Jews around the world and to give advice to Jewish communities that are under threat. Israel teaches Hebrew around the world. Israel teaches Jewish culture around the world. Israel, through Masa, helps bring Jews from around the world to this country. Israel, through Birthright, helps bring Jews. There are a host of things that Israel continues to do on behalf of the Jewish people. Few of them as dramatic as the Eichmann trial, but in terms of their symbolism and in their essence, that remains very much part of Israel's work.
Women? Kenny, and then Mike.
Do you have any insight or opinion, understanding of the decision to put Yad Vashem next to Har Herzl about 20 years ago to connect it with an actual historical path connecting the two stories? And how does that, for people who say there wouldn't be a state of Israel, there wouldn't have been a state of Israel if it hadn't been for the Holocaust, how would you respond to that comment?
I was promised easy questions. Putting Yad Vashem anywhere in the state of Israel creates a natural bridge between Yad Vashem and the fact that Israel exists. Whether you do have a bridge or you don't have a bridge, the moment you walk out of Yad Vashem and you see the trees of the land of Israel blooming again after a couple of thousand years where they didn't flourish, and if you happen to know any psukim about what are the signs of the Geulah, then you're going to make that connection. You know what? You don't even have to know the psukim. You just look around and you see it. So the specific question, whether, and it happens nobody consulted me on whether they should connect these or not, which is just as well. I don't think that that's the essential thing. I think we need to, right, the state of Israel came about for a host of reasons, some more spiritual, some more political. The state of Israel would almost certainly have come about without the Holocaust, and in fact the Holocaust, which deprived the Jewish people of the largest source of potential immigrants, in many ways undercut the establishment of the state of Israel. And the claim that Israel is in some way the result of the Holocaust, I think, is unfair and inaccurate in a host of ways. Obviously there are connections between them, but the state of Israel came about both because apparently it was time for the state of Israel to come about, and because there were people who acted decisively in order to bring it about, and because there were people around the world, not Jewish, who thought that this was the right moment. And I don't like being in the business of determining exactly what led to what and how to connect or reconnect. And as Rev. Karlinsky said, the Holocaust was the greatest tragedy of the Jewish people in the 20th century, if not in the last 20, at least 19 centuries. Only exceeded by the destruction of the Second Temple and the resulting exile. And the state of Israel was one of the the rebirth of the state of Israel was one of the great moments. It's enough for me to know that we had both of them and to learn about both of them. I don't need to do more than that.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Mike will be the last question. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Norman.
But Eichmann, seems to me he was the only criminal ever executed in the state of Israel, correct?
You are correct.
It
wasn't actually.
Israel has a death penalty, which it does not apply. This case was seen as so extraordinary, and the enormity of the crime was so great that it was seen by many people. Remember, the day after Ben Gurion announces this, secular newspapers are quoting from Tehillim about the God of vengeance. This was different from anything that Israel faced before or anything Israel has faced since.
Mike will be the last question. Great.
So Eichmann was obviously a very big figure to try. What about sort of rank and file Nazis throughout? Obviously Israel couldn't capture all of them and bring them to trial, so was there some sort of less legal or covert, operations?
Did they capture any other Nazis?
There have been other Nazis who have been extradited to Israel, particularly those who were much later on in their lives. But there wasn't any kind of wholesale success in bringing Nazis here. If you ask people from the security services what was their greatest disappointment, there was one other guy they really wanted to bring here, Mengele. And he was in Argentina, they were on the trail, they lost the trail. Some people say that it was their error. I think that it's when you're running a small, beleaguered country, you can't be expected to pull off every single miracle. The identification of Eichmann, the capture of Eichmann, bringing him to Israel, all of that's a miracle. You can't expect miracles all of the time. What there was right after the Second World War, there were efforts to send young Israelis, militarily trained. They went to Europe, they found Nazis there, and they carried out a less formalistic form of justice. They would identify them. Once they'd made the identification, they'd say, I'm from the state of Israel, and
Goodbye.
in one way or another. I'm not an expert on that, but there were efforts like that. There was a lot more of that than there was of bringing Nazis here. Bringing Nazis in from countries that are mostly friendly to Israel is not a simple thing to do, and you don't violate a country's sovereignty unless you're bringing in an Eichmann or a Mengele. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.